Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. This afternoon, the Reserve Bank, in all likelihood, will cut interest rates. And while mortgage holders will welcome any relief, there are bigger questions over what a rate cut will mean for house prices and, in turn, housing affordability. Peter Munckton is the Chief Economist at Bank of Queensland. Peter, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much for inviting me on, Sean.
First off, do you think we'll get a rate cut this afternoon?
Oh, look, I'd be a little bit surprised if they don't cut rates. First of all, at their previous meeting in April, they're very open-minded. In the inflation number at the end of April, if you look at the trim mean numbers for the last two quarters, it suggests that underlying inflation is about where the RBA wants it to be. If you look at the economic growth numbers, things are looking somewhat better than they were this time last year, but still not terrific. And of course, since we know the last month or two, we've got the Trump tariffs come on board, which gives us downside economic risk. So you've got inflation about where the RBA wants it. You've got economic growth maybe improving, but not quite as strong as we need it to be. And then finally, there's a widespread agreement amongst economists that basically interest rates are above this sort of long-term average level. So add all that together, inflation about average, interest rates above average, economic growth a little bit weak, you get a rate cut. So I'd be very surprised if the RBA doesn't cut rates today.
Okay, so let's park that. We'll come back to that later in this discussion. The housing market. Start with the big picture. What's the current state of housing affordability in Australia?
Oh, not great. Is the short answer. And I think, that's sort of a widespread view virtually anywhere you go. People, if you want to get a discussion going, you just sort of say, gee, aren't house prices high? And therefore you don't even talk for the rest of the night. Right? Sort of everyone knows and cannot believe about how high house prices are. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, Sean, and maybe we can touch on those. But the biggest one is that we've got a growing population. We haven't been able to build enough homes for them.
So is that, it's a supply issue at the end of the day?
Well, as any economists say, it's demand and supply.
Yeah.
So there is the two things. First of all, about 20 years ago, we did have a step up in population growth. We've had since then an increased ability to actually increase our dwelling supply or the number of new dwellings we build. So that's been a good thing. The issue's been we just haven't been able to increase our dwelling supply enough. And I think that's sort of been the big issue, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, about why affordability is a problem. That we've got a strongly growing population, but our ability to supply housing for that growing population hasn't been good enough.
So the growth in population has been higher than the growth in supply. And is that why home ownership's at a 70-year low?
That's exactly right. So, you've got strong demand for housing, not enough supply of it. So house prices go up. Lo and behold, less people can afford it. And what we've got is sort of decline in home ownership. And as you correctly say, if you actually look at the numbers, you really have to go back to the 1950s to see a lower number than where we are today. That's, of course, not the only implication, right? That's sort of the ability of people to get into the market. A second consequence is that your ability to pay off the mortgage is not as easy because the mortgage is so big, so it takes you a lot longer to do so. So the proportion of people who's actually got a home, the proportion who actually got a mortgage is pretty high. And the third thing, obviously, is that if you do have a mortgage, because it is so big, then the proportion of your incomes going to have to serve that mortgage is actually quite high right now.
Yeah, so in a note you wrote in the last couple of days, which I thought was really interesting, the point that the cost of living crisis at the moment, it's exacerbated by these other points that you're making, by the fact that it is really hard to make those repayments and house prices are so high. Therefore, it seems that this cost of living crisis seems to be worse than previous ones. At least the economy, plenty of the economic data looks okay, but we're all feeling it a lot more or something like that. And maybe that is related to housing.
Oh, sure. I think that's part of the story here. So, the unusual thing about, the economic crisis, we can use that term we've got now, is the unemployment rate so low.
Yeah.
Like it's extraordinary. Like essentially our unemployment rate's near 50-year lows, and yet we're really concerned about things. And that is very consistent. The surveys that ask households, how do you think about the state of your budget or the state of your own finances? And it's picked up a little bit recently, but essentially last year, the answer to that survey was, I feel my budget is as bad a state as it is during a deep recession. Right? Yep. So why is that? So the first bit, as we're going through, is that the housing affordability is playing a role. The size of the mortgage, it's not so much the level of the interest rate so much. The size of the mortgage is just so big that obviously takes a fair bit of your free incomes. The second bit, though, which is something that we really haven't been confronted consistently as an economy now for about 30 years was the inflation rate. So the inflation rate, the level of prices has gone up about 25% in the last 2 years. Our wages, by and large, haven't gone up by 25% over the last 2 or 3 years. And so all of a sudden, that's been a really big negative. So it's a really, really big negative, obviously, is that not only do you got to face a higher cost of, bread and milk, etc., but on top of that, you've got the big mortgage. And so if you actually look about which segments of society are really, really feeling it tough, those segments of society that have got a big housing cost, and they're either A, those with a mortgage, or B, those who've got rent, those are the ones in particular who feel like their family finances are not great state.
Stay with me, Peter. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Bank of Queensland Chief Economist Peter Munckton. Peter, what's the solution to the housing crisis? And I'm on the supply side, firstly. Is it about being more productive in the way we build houses?
So the first bit is, the short answer is, Sean, yes. And then the question is about how do we go about doing that? If we think about the last 10 or 15 years, what have been the constraints about our ability to supply more homes? So one constraint has been regulation. We know, I'm speaking to you from Sydney, and in Sydney, one of the issues has been quite a number of councils have, limited the ability to increase housing supply in the council regions. So one is sort of regulation. Are we allowing our regulations the maximum number of houses to be built? The second thing is that we talked about stronger population growth, and we talked about we haven't had enough investment in housing. Two other things have happened. We haven't had enough business investment, which is one of the factors, in my view, the biggest factor about why productivity growth is so low. And the third thing was we've had a big, strong increase in population, but for a long period of time, we didn't invest enough in infrastructure. Now, go around any city, any state, you'll find lots and lots of work happening in infrastructure, so we can't complain about that. But of course, if people are doing a whole lot of work in infrastructure, that means the labour and the materials are either A, not going to be available, or B, going to be more costly, particularly for the sorts of housing that happens in the big capital cities. Right? Increasingly, the amount of the housing stock will be units. The sort of people that build big units are also the sort of people who can be working on infrastructure projects. And of course, the steel that you use in infrastructure projects is also the steel you'll be using in big unit blocks. So, all this is linked together, Sean, that basically we had strong population growth, but we just have not enough investment. We're doing some of that investment now, but ironically, some of the investment we're doing in infrastructure, which we need, let's face it, we're stuck in traffic all the time, and we want to get out of there quicker. We need that infrastructure investment, but we also need the investment in housing. And that's great. Right now, that extra investment in infrastructure is creating, a bit of an issue.
Is it tilt too far towards infrastructure at the moment vis-a-vis housing?
Look, I think that just given, our ability to actually, build things, because, building infrastructure projects is difficult, right? Every particular, there are big projects, they're complex projects, the actual productivity, you try and get that right is pretty hard. If I had to sort of say, what's the number one issue right now, trying to get better infrastructure is clearly a key one.
Yep.
But in my view, probably the number one is housing affordability. And so when we think going forward, where do we want resources over the next 3 to 5 years? Having more resources devoted to residential construction, I think, would be pretty useful. There is a good news story here, Sean, that, if we look at some of the indicators you want to see about where is construction going to be in 6 months, 18 months' time, some of those indicators are starting to look better. Right? So I think some of this stuff will just cyclically improve, but maybe over the next 3 to 5 years, maybe we'll put some of the infrastructure projects maybe down a notch, allow the residential construction to get built, and then get back to the infrastructure projects. Maybe that's a possible solution.
Okay, so let's bring in this afternoon's probable rate cut. What does that mean for the housing sector, given where we are at supply and demand-wise?
Well, it means a couple of things. The first one is, you get lower interest rates. That's obviously very good for borrowers. And so we talked about the cost of living squeeze and so forth. One benefit we've had is the lower inflation relative to wages growth. So there's a little bit more disposable income there. A second benefit we've had is the tax cuts. And then the third benefit people get, obviously, is the lower rates. So all of a sudden, there's more and more disposable income out there. And people are starting to find that out. If that survey I spoke about earlier on, if you look at the responses and that, compared to this time last year, people do understand their finances are getting better. And I think that will improve. So that's, one big plus. The second plus is that if you want to get in the market, lower interest rates is obviously pretty useful, but that can bring us to the third thing, like the supply and demand question, right? So if more people can get in and potentially pay a higher price, there's an unchanged supply, higher demand, unchanged supply, get you a somewhat higher price. And I suspect that the house prices might pick up a little bit from here, mainly because the lower interest rates allow more people to be in the market. Now, because of the affordability issue we've talked a lot about, Sean, I wouldn't expect massive increases in house price in this particular cycle, but I would be surprised if they don't pick up a little bit where we are today. And that's purely and simply because history would tell us usually lower interest rates doesn't lead to some rise in house prices.
Peter, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Excellent, Sean. Thanks very much for the invite again.
That was Peter Munckton, Chief Economist at Bank of Queensland. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.